allowed to eat the Passover? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Exodus on walking through the Bible.
Of his word, the glory of his cross.
If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to Exodus chapter 12. We're going to be reading from verses 43 to 51. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So, Exodus chapter 12, beginning at verse 43. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "This is the ordinance of the Passover. No foreigner shall eat it. But every man's servant who is bought for money, when you have circumcised him, then he may eat it. A sojourner and a hired servant shall not eat it. In one house shall it be eaten. You shall not carry any of the flesh outside the house, nor shall you break one of its bones. All the congregation of Israel shall keep it. And when a stranger dwells with you and wants to keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised, and then let him come near and keep it. And he shall be as a native of the land. For no uncircumcised person shall eat it. One law shall be for the native born and for the stranger who dwells among you." Thus all the children of Israel did. As the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did. And it came to pass on that very same day that the Lord brought the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt, according to their armies. In our last episode, we discussed two controversial issues: the beginning of the Exodus route and how long Israel was actually in Egypt. For the Exodus route, we put up a map with permission from Bible.ca. On the map that you now see, the traditional route is the crossing at the port of Suez into what is called by us today the Sinai Peninsula. This, of course, is due to the assumption that Mount Sinai is Mount Musa, but as we discussed in chapter 3, Mount Musa cannot be the location of Mount Sinai. With this being the case, the whole Exodus route is changed. Succoth is not a place on the western side of the Gulf of Suez, but on the eastern side, between the Gulf of Suez and the mountains in the Sinai Peninsula. The Red Sea crossing is over the Gulf of Aqaba, that right-hand finger of the Red Sea. But didn't God say in Exodus 13:17 that he didn't take them by the way of the Philistines, lest Israel see war and want to return to Egypt? Yes, but the way of the Philistines is simply the route along the southern shore of the Mediterranean, the quickest route to Canaan. Once they made the easier crossing from Goshen into the Sinai Peninsula, God turned them south along the coastal plain where they came to Succoth. The other controversy was how long the children of Israel were in Egypt. The text in Exodus 12 says 430 years to the day. Confusion arises from the text in Galatians 3:17, which seems to indicate that this 430 years started with Abraham. A closer examination of the text reveals, though, that Galatians is talking about the ratification of the covenant with Abraham, and although this occurred many times in Genesis, it occurred the last time in Genesis 46, 2-4, just before Jacob went to Egypt. Therefore, the 430 years in Egypt are actually 430 years in Egypt, not the traditional 215 years. In today's reading, we have God again giving Moses some Passover regulations. These regulations are different to the ones we read earlier in that they specifically identify who was allowed to eat the Passover. God identifies in verse 43 that no foreigner shall eat the Passover. In other words, the Passover was for the Jewish people, the covenant people of God in the Old Testament. However, if you have a servant that was bought for money, when you have circumcised him, then he may eat of the Passover. If you recall back to Genesis 17:13, the Hebrews were commanded to circumcise anyone who is bought with their money, this being a person who was brought into their household and treated as their family. However, a sojourner, meaning a stranger or a foreigner or a hired servant, a servant who was not brought into the household and treated like family, were not to eat of it. The Passover was to be eaten in a house and not to be taken out of the house, showing us that the Passover was a communal meal with family, not a meal to be eaten of wherever you chose. Added to that they were not to break one of the lamb's bones that was used as the Passover lamb, pointing us to our Passover lamb, Jesus, which John 19:36 says, not a bone of his body was broken. The entire congregation of Israel was to keep this feast. If a stranger dwells with them and wants to eat of the Passover, he and all his males, meaning males in his family, must be circumcised, brought under the covenant with Abraham, which will then make him a native to the land and allow him to eat the Passover. No uncircumcised person was to eat of the Passover. Thus there was the law of the Passover for the native born, the law of the Passover for the stranger who dwelled among them. Some Christians today feel that it is proper for Christians to eat the Passover. My question is why? It was to remind the Jewish people of God passing over them in Egypt. They might respond back that there were strangers in the land who under certain conditions were allowed to eat. Yes, but they had to be circumcised, brought into the covenant of Abraham. Today, nobody is commanded to be physically circumcised, nor do we obey the old law. We're under Christ today. So if you want to fulfill this part of God's old law, which means be circumcised in order to be under God's covenant with Abraham, Galatians 5:1-2 says you've fallen from grace. We become heirs of the promise of Abraham today, not by being circumcised, but by being baptized into Christ, as Galatians 3:26-29 says. We do remember the Passover today, no, not the physical Passover, but the spiritual Passover, and remembering Jesus' death on the cross, Jesus being our Passover, according to 1 Corinthians 5:7. We do this not once a year, but every Sunday, as Acts 20:7 would show us. That is what the early disciples did. Getting back to Exodus 12 now, it closes by stating that Israel obeyed the words of the Lord spoken through Moses and Aaron, and God brought them up out of the land of Egypt. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Exodus chapter 13, verses 1-10, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time.
I'm not ashamed.
Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.
Of his cross.